Power corrupts, but in the hands of the wrong king, it can destroy entire nations. Throughout history, some rulers proved so dangerously unfit to govern that their reigns ended in chaos, rebellion, and rivers of blood. These men lost wars, betrayed their people, and dragged their kingdoms into ruin. Yet centuries after their deaths, they continue to captivate us. So strong is the fascination with these failed monarchs that their tombs have been broken open, their coffins violated, and their remains exposed, simply so the world could look once more upon the faces of history's most disastrous kings. In this documentary, we uncover 5 of the worst rulers ever to sit on a throne and reveal the shocking discoveries made when their graves were desecrated and their burial vaults forced open. If you enjoy exploring the darker side of history, be sure to support the channel by subscribing. One of the most notorious of these rulers is King John of England, widely regarded as one of the worst monarchs the country ever endured. His reign was marked by territorial losses and widespread rebellion. He is best remembered as the king who was compelled to sign the Magna Carta, and as a ruler known for his suspicion, cruelty, and vengeful nature. Although he possessed an extensive knowledge of his kingdom, his leadership proved disastrous. King John died on October 19, 1216 at Newark Castle at the age of 49. Contemporary accounts described him as unpleasant, dangerous, and ruthlessly cruel. Over the centuries, his coffin was eventually broken into, and what was discovered inside astonished those who saw it. Originally, John was never expected to wear the crown. During the reign of his father, Henry II, he was viewed as a spare heir, despite being his father's favorite son. In 1189, John's brother ascended the throne as Richard I. However, John later became Richard's successor and officially became king in 1199. Soon after his coronation, conflict with France reignited. This was sparked by John's second marriage. Tasked with settling a dispute between 2 rival noble families, John instead married Isabella of Angoulême, who had already been promised to the opposing family. This act provoked rebellion, and John was summoned before the French king. When he failed to appear, war broke out between England and France. By 1206, King John had suffered devastating losses, surrendering vast French territories, including Normandy and Anjou. Desperate to reclaim his lands, he heavily increased taxes across England and aggressively enforced his feudal rights. These measures placed enormous strain on the population, fueling widespread anger and resentment throughout the kingdom. Discontent among the barons continued to grow, and repeated negotiations between them and the king ultimately failed. In May 1215, open civil war erupted. Rebel forces quickly seized control of London, forcing King John to negotiate. These talks concluded on June 19, 1215 at Runnymede, beside the River Thames, where John agreed to the terms of the Magna Carta. The charter placed limits on royal authority, protected feudal rights, and, most importantly, formally established that the king, like his subjects, was subject to the rule of law and not above it. John later claimed that he had agreed to the charter under duress. The popes supported John's position and declared the Magna Carta invalid. Enraged, the king launched a brutal campaign across northern England and along the Scottish borders, devastating the region with his army. At the request of the rebelling barons, Prince Louis of France was invited to invade England. Despite this, John continued to wage war. In September 1216, John began a renewed military campaign, marching from the Cotswolds to relieve Windsor Castle and attacking numerous settlements along the way. While in Lynn, he contracted dysentery, an illness that would soon prove fatal. As further invasions threatened England, John traveled west, but during the journey, he lost much of his baggage train while crossing a tidal estuary in the Washington. Many of the king's personal possessions, including the crown jewels, were lost. Some accounts claim they were swallowed by quicksand, although this has never been conclusively proven. By this time, John's health had significantly deteriorated. He stopped to rest at Swineshead Abbey in the Lincolnshire Fens before continuing to nearby Newark Castle. There was later debate over whether John had been poisoned at the abbey by a monk or the abbot, who was allegedly reluctant to host him. John ate and drank with the monks, but by the time he reached Newark Castle, it was clear he was gravely ill. King John died in October 1216 at Newark Castle, reportedly in a latrine. The official cause of death was dysentery, a severe and often fatal disease marked by extreme diarrhea. Rumors later circulated that he had died after consuming too many unripe peaches, drinking excessive amounts of ale, or being deliberately poisoned. A historian later suggested that claims of overindulgence were a way to criticize John's character, implying gluttony, recklessness, and poor judgment, while accusations of poisoning reflected how deeply he was despised. Whatever the truth, those recording history showed little sympathy for the king. Dysentery is caused by parasites in the digestive system and is commonly spread through contaminated food or water, often polluted with human waste. Although frequently associated with unsanitary living conditions among the poor, the disease could affect anyone. Much of the food at the time was grown in soil fertilized with human waste, and John could have contracted the illness in several ways, particularly while drinking contaminated water during his campaigns. Following his death, John's body was embalmed by the abbot of Croxton Abbey in Leicestershire, and his internal organs were buried there. Nothing of that burial site remains today. It is believed that his heart was placed in a gold container and buried elsewhere. John was laid in a trapezoidal stone coffin with a rounded head recess and was initially buried beneath the floor of the Lady Chapel in Worcester Cathedral. In 1232, John's body was disturbed and moved to the cathedral's high altar. An effigy was carved from the original coffin lid and placed atop the tomb. In 1529, the monument was reconfigured into a table tomb. At this time, it was reported that John's body was wrapped in gold and silver cloth and adorned with various royal regalia. The coffin may have been disturbed again during the English Civil War, but it is certain that it was opened in July 1797. When examined, investigators discovered that John's skull had been turned at an unnatural angle during an earlier movement, causing damage. Both jawbones had detached and were found near the right elbow, and one leg bone was missing, having apparently been stolen. What also became clear was that John's burial differed greatly from that of other medieval monarchs. While kings and queens were typically interred in elaborate ceremonial dress, John had been buried wearing a simple monk's habit, complete with a cowl tied beneath his chin. This may have been due to limited clothing available to the abbot who embalmed him, or it may have been a deliberate request by John himself. He had previously been treated kindly by monks, and the choice of burial clothing may have reflected a desire to show humility, religious devotion, or even to seek forgiveness for the civil war he had brought upon his kingdom. When the coffin was opened, the monk's robes were found to be remarkably well preserved, and the skeleton itself was in relatively good condition. However, no flesh remained on the body, and a number of maggots were found inside the coffin, indicating that the embalming process had not been entirely successful. King John is remembered as one of the worst rulers in English history. In death, his body was moved multiple times, and his coffin was repeatedly disturbed. Those who opened it found not the remains of a king laid to rest in royal splendor, but a man buried much like a high-ranking monk. A subdued and modest burial for a ruler many believed did not deserve to lie among England's greatest monarchs in Westminster Abbey. Let's look at Henry VI. Henry VI's reign was marked by failure, instability, and tragedy. Unlike his father, the formidable Henry V, he was unable to maintain England's hard-won territories in France. One by one, the lands gained during the 100 Years' War were lost, while at home political disorder deepened. Rivalries among the nobility grew more intense, loyalties became divided, and England drifted steadily towards civil war. By 1453, the situation worsened dramatically when Henry suffered a severe mental breakdown. Unable to rule, he withdrew from public life, leaving powerful nobles to fight amongst themselves rather than govern the kingdom. This political vacuum ignited the Wars of the Roses in 1455, a brutal civil war that pitted the House of Lancaster against the ambitious House of York. Henry's weakness soon cost him his crown. In 1461, he was overthrown by the Duke of York's eldest son, who claimed the throne as Edward IV. From that moment, the conflict became a struggle between a failing king and a rising warrior. Edward proved the stronger force, while Henry became a symbol of a lost cause. Captured in 1465, Henry was imprisoned in the Tower of London, where he was initially treated with a degree of respect. But his story was far from over. In a dramatic twist, Richard Neville, the powerful Earl of Warwick, known to history as the Kingmaker, restored Henry to the throne. This extraordinary comeback, called the Readeption, marked the first time an English king had been deposed and then returned to power. Yet the triumph was short-lived, lasting less than 6 months. Warwick's gamble failed. He was killed at the Battle of Barnet, and soon after, the Yorkists crushed their enemies at the Battle of Tewkesbury on May 4, 1471. Henry's only son was killed, ending Lancaster's hopes of survival. Henry himself was once again imprisoned in the Tower, this time as Edward IV helpless captive. Now seen as a dangerous liability, Henry's fate was sealed. When Edward returned to London, word spread that the former king had died on the evening of May 21, 1471. Official records claimed he succumbed to grief and melancholy, broken by the loss of his son and crown. Yet few believed this gentle explanation. Many suspected that Henry VI was quietly murdered on Edward IV orders, eliminated to ensure the Wars of the Roses would never reignite around his name. Henry VI's life ended not with glory, but in silence and shadow, one of the most tragic figures of England's civil wars. The Tudor chronicler Sir Thomas More recorded in his History of Richard III that Richard, then Duke of Gloucester, was responsible for the murder of Henry VI while he was imprisoned in the Tower of London. According to this account, Henry was praying in a small chapel within the Wakefield Tower when he was attacked from behind and killed in a violent and savage manner. However, this version of events has been questioned, as Wakefield Tower was being used for storage at the time and was not necessarily a royal residence or prison space. What is certain is that Henry was confined within the tower, even if the exact location of his death remains uncertain. Centuries later, rumors surrounding the fate of Henry VI appeared to be confirmed. After his death, Henry's body was buried at Chertsey Abbey. His corpse was displayed in an open coffin and carried through London to Old St. Paul's Cathedral, where it lay on public view for several days to demonstrate that the former king was truly dead. Following this, the coffin was taken to Blackfriars Monastery, where the funeral was held. It was then placed on a barge and transported approximately 15 miles up the River Thames for burial in the Lady Chapel at Chertsey Abbey. Over time, Henry's burial site became a place of pilgrimage, with reports that miracles were occurring at his tomb. As a result of this growing devotion, Richard III ordered the exhumation of Henry's body on August 12, 1495. It was claimed that the body was found to be remarkably well preserved. The remains were then moved to St. George's Chapel at Windsor, where Henry was reburied just southwest of the altar, on the opposite side of his former enemy, Edward IV. Initially, the tomb was a low-table tomb featuring a recumbent effigy of the king in armor. Before 1492, there was even an appeal made to the Pope to consider Henry VI for canonization as a saint. Later, Henry VIII, the first Tudor king, constructed the Lady Chapel at Westminster Abbey and intended to have Henry VI reburied there. Permission was granted in 1504 for Henry's body to be exhumed and transferred to Westminster Abbey, but this plan was never carried out. As a result, Henry remained buried at St. George's Chapel, and the attempt to have him canonized also came to nothing. In 1786, Henry VI's burial vault was moved to a different location, though it was not opened at that time. The coffin itself remained undisturbed, and only a small stone slab was left to mark the new burial site. However, in January 1910, the brick vault containing Henry's remains was opened. Inside, a small lead chest was discovered amidst a considerable amount of debris and refuse, including iron bands from a decayed wooden coffin measuring approximately 2 meters in length and 1 meter in width. On November 5, 1910, the chest and coffin were examined more closely. Inside was found a deteriorated wooden box, which contained the bones of King Henry VI. The remains were completely disordered, with the skull showing signs of damage and the right arm missing entirely. Further examination of the skull revealed striking evidence relating to the manner of Henry's death. Brown hair was still attached to the skull nearly 500 years after his death. Some sections of the hair were noticeably darker and contained clotted blood, indicating that Henry's head and hair had not been washed during embalming. The presence of blood in the hair strongly suggested a violent death. It indicated that Henry VI had most likely been murdered while imprisoned in the Tower of London. Examination of the remains showed that he had either been struck with a heavy object or weapon, or possibly stabbed, with injuries consistent with a blow to the head from something such as a sword. After the investigation, the lead chest was repaired, and the bones were individually wrapped in silk before being placed back inside, along with fragments of the original iron fittings. A new marble slab was installed to mark the burial site. Today, Henry VI is generally remembered as a weak and ineffective king. He was unprepared for rule, having become King of England at just 8 months old. He is also remembered as King of France and as the greatest loser of the Wars of the Roses. His reign was marked by limited achievements, and his mental fragility contributed to political instability that plunged England into civil war, preventing the country from being ruled by a strong and authoritative monarch. Henry VI was almost certainly murdered in the Tower of London on the orders of his enemies, and it was only centuries later, when his coffin was opened, that the true nature of his death became clear. One of the most dramatic executions in English history occurred centuries later, when King Charles I was executed on January 30th, 1649. He was taken to a specially constructed scaffold outside Whitehall after being condemned by Parliament and figures such as Oliver Cromwell for plunging England into its bloodiest civil war. Charles I was executed by an anonymous executioner who beheaded the king with a single blow of the axe. However, once his remains were collected, Parliament faced the problem of what to do with his body, fearing that it might become a royalist relic and be venerated by those opposed to England's new political order. King Charles I was buried in secrecy alongside one of England's most controversial and notorious monarchs, Henry VIII. However, more than 200 years after Charles's execution, his coffin would be broken into. The execution of Charles I was a shocking and unprecedented event. Under heavy armed guard, he was taken to the Palace of Whitehall, next to the site where his execution would take place. He was escorted through a window of the banqueting house and onto the scaffold, where members of the public had gathered to watch. Charles addressed the crowd, though his speech was difficult for many to hear. In his speech, he stated, "An unjust sentence that I suffered to take effect is punished now by an unjust sentence on me. But I must tell you that their liberty and freedom consists in having government. It is not their having a share in the government. That is nothing appertaining unto them. A subject and a sovereign are clean different things. Before finishing, I shall go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be." His words were ominous and reflected a man who believed his earthly life was coming to an end. At around 2 p.m., Charles surrendered himself to the executioner. After saying a prayer, he lowered himself onto the block and signaled that he was ready by stretching out his arms. The executioner then delivered the fatal blow with the axe. The king was beheaded, and the crowd responded not with celebration but with a collective sigh. Many believed that Charles I had been appointed by God to rule, and they feared divine punishment for what they had just witnessed. The executioner held the king's severed head up for the crowd to see before the remains were gathered and placed into a coffin for burial. Following the execution, Charles's body was embalmed. During this process, royal physicians and surgeons reattached the head of the Stuart monarch to his body. Debate then arose over where the lead-lined coffin should be buried. Parliament feared that burying Charles in central London would be too dangerous, as the grave might be disturbed. They also refused to allow him the honor of burial alongside other monarchs in Westminster Abbey. Parliament worried that his grave could become a shrine and feared retaliation for having ordered his execution. Eventually, it was decided that Charles would be buried at Windsor Castle, specifically in St. George's Chapel. This burial was to be carried out in secret, as Windsor was considered a quieter and more controlled location. Although the royal vaults there would become increasingly occupied in later centuries, at the time, it was chosen to avoid public attention. In the early hours of February 9th, 1649, Charles I's coffin was quietly transported from central London to Windsor. He was buried in the same vault as King Henry VIII, who rested in a purpose-built tomb alongside his third wife, Jane Seymour. The vault was considered a secluded and private space. Although there were later plans for Charles II, the executed king's son, to rebury his father in a grand mausoleum in Hyde Park, these plans were never realized. To this day, Charles I remains buried in the same vault as Henry VIII, two brutal kings lying side by side. For centuries, it was believed that Charles I's coffin had been lost and that his remains were missing. However, during building work in 1813, the burial vault was accidentally broken into. During this discovery, builders also found the remains of a child's coffin, believed to be that of Queen Anne's child who had died tragically. By the early 19th century, Henry VI's coffin was said to be in a dreadful condition. It had been badly damaged over time, and stories circulated that people had even broken into it and stolen his bones. Lying nearby, however, was another coffin, one believed to belong to the long-lost remains of the executed king, Charles I. The man tasked with investigating this extraordinary discovery was Sir Henry Halford. On April 1, 1813, he opened Charles's coffin in the presence of the Prince Regent, the future King George IV, to confirm once and for all that the body was truly that of the executed Stuart monarch. When the coffin was opened, Halford immediately noticed that Charles's head was no longer firmly attached to the body. Although the head had been sewn back on after the execution, the stitching had clearly decayed over the centuries. An inscription on the coffin read simply, King Charles, 1649. It was also clear that Charles's body had been prepared in a distinctive way. He had been wrapped in multiple layers of cerecloth, which had preserved him remarkably well. The wrappings were so extensive that Halford was forced to lift the body out of the coffin in order to remove them. Halford later wrote that, at length the whole face was disengaged from its covering. The skin was darkened and discolored, yet the forehead and temples had lost little of their muscular substance. The cartilage of the nose had disappeared entirely. Most striking of all, the left eye was, at the first moment of exposure, open and full, though it vanished almost immediately. The pointed beard, so characteristic of King Charles's reign, remained perfectly intact. The face was long and oval in shape. Many of the teeth were still present, and the left ear was found completely intact, preserved by the layer of unctuous matter between it and the cerecloth. Halford admitted that it was difficult not to declare that, despite the disfigurement, the face bore a powerful resemblance to the images familiar from coins, busts, and, most notably, the famous portraits of Charles I painted by Van Dyck. While he acknowledged that those present were prepared to see this likeness, he insisted that the resemblance was undeniable. The shape of the face, the forehead, the eye, the beard, and the defining features by which identity is recognized all confirmed the conclusion. When the head was fully freed from the remaining attachments, it was found to be completely loose and was lifted easily for closer inspection. It was still wet and left a greenish-red stain on both paper and linen when touched. The back of the scalp was perfectly preserved and had a remarkably fresh appearance, with the pores of the skin clearly visible, as they often are when soaked in moisture. The tendons and ligaments of the neck remained thick and firm. The hair at the back of the head was dense and appeared almost black. Once cleaned and dried, it was revealed to be a rich dark brown, while the beard was a slightly redder shade. The hair at the back of the head measured more than an inch in length and had likely been cut short either for the convenience of the executioner or by loyal supporters shortly after death, possibly to create keepsakes in memory of the unfortunate king. This discovery marked a major achievement for Sir Henry Halford. He had located the remains of an executed king of England and had personally held up the severed head, confirming beyond doubt that it belonged to Charles I. His examination revealed that the muscles of the neck had retracted significantly and that the fourth cervical vertebra had been cleanly severed across its substance. The surface of the cut bone was smooth and even, evidence that could only have been produced by a single, heavy blow from an exceptionally sharp instrument. This confirmed that the king had indeed been executed by a weapon such as an axe. Once the examination of the head was complete and every purpose had been served, the body below the neck was not further disturbed. The head was returned to its place. The coffin was carefully soldered shut, and the vault was sealed once more. This marked the final occasion on which the burial vault containing King Charles I and also Henry VIII was ever opened. Charles I was a man who had led his nation into civil war, and many believe that his fate on that cold January morning in 1649 was justified. Yet centuries later, when his remains were unwrapped and his coffin opened before a stunned audience, including a future king, the physical evidence of his violent death brought the full weight of that moment in history sharply back to life. King Louis XVI. One of the most important witnesses to the final moments of King Louis XVI was his confessor, a priest who stayed with him throughout his last day. According to the priest, the journey to the guillotine was harsh and physically difficult. The path leading to the scaffold was rough and hard to cross, forcing the king to lean on the priest's arm for support. Because Louis walked so slowly, the priest feared, if only for a moment, that the king's courage might fail him. That fear vanished at the foot of the scaffold. As soon as Louis XVI reached the final step, he suddenly released the priest's arm and crossed the entire width of the platform with a firm and steady stride. With a single look, he silenced 15 or 20 drums positioned opposite the scaffold. Then, in a voice so powerful that it could be heard from far away, the priest distinctly heard him proclaim these unforgettable words: "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge. I pardon those who have occasioned my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are going to shed may never be visited on France." The executioner and his assistant approached him on the scaffold as nearly 80,000 guards stood surrounding the execution structure to prevent any unrest. The Place de la Révolution in Paris was packed to capacity, crowded with spectators. Louis XVI wanted to address the people once more, but he was prevented from doing so. Still, he managed to shout, "Gentlemen, I am innocent of everything of which I am accused. I hope that my blood may cement the good fortune of the French." Moments later, he was hurriedly strapped onto the tilting board, his neck placed beneath the slanted blade of the guillotine. The executioner released the blade, and it fell with great speed. Almost immediately, debate arose over whether the execution had gone wrong due to the haste. Some claimed the blade did not cleanly sever the neck at first, instead striking the king's chin and shattering it as it fell. Nevertheless, Louis XVI's head was ultimately severed. The severed head was then lifted and displayed to the crowd. A contemporary painting shows it fastened to a pole, held high in the air by the executioner so all could see. Some guards even tried to dip their handkerchiefs into the king's blood as souvenirs of the moment. Attention then turned to what came next, the burial of the king. His body and head were placed onto the back of a cart and driven away to the old Church of the Madeleine, a burial site commonly used for enemies of the revolution after execution. This choice was deliberate. No special arrangements were to be made for Louis XVI. In death, he was to be treated as a common criminal. Inside the church, a short funeral service and memorial were permitted. Two priests, both sworn in their utmost loyalty to the revolution, conducted the brief ceremony. In the graveyard, gravediggers had prepared a shallow grave. It was not particularly deep, and at its base lay a thick bed of quicklime, intended to reduce the king's remains to almost nothing as quickly as possible. One of the priests who supervised the burial later recalled, "I called for silence, and a detachment of the gendarmes showed us the body. It was clothed in a white vest and gray silk breeches with matching stockings. We chanted vespers and the service for the dead. In pursuance of an executive order, the body, lying in its open coffin, was thrown onto a bed of quicklime at the bottom of the pit and covered with a layer of earth, the whole being firmly and thoroughly tamped down. Louis XVI's head was placed at his feet. After the coffin was lowered, more quicklime was thrown over the remains to hasten decay and ensure their disappearance. Although the authorities intended for the burial place to remain secret, this plan failed. It soon became widely known where Louis XVI had been buried, and in later years people came to visit the site and pay their respects. The king had been buried wearing his shirt, waistcoat, breeches, and stockings, and was laid to rest roughly 10 feet from the cemetery wall. The grave was not deep enough. It did not reach the required depth of 12 feet and remained noticeably shallow. One of the grave diggers later testified, "When they arrived, I was still in the pit. I got out quickly and set to work with my spade on that pile of quicklime over there, where you can still see the traces. There were 5 sacks of lime pellets. I mixed the lime with water to form a paste, and with the help of another man, we poured additional water onto it until it began to boil. Nearby were the wooden coffins, with a large basket beside them. I removed the body from the basket and attempted to untie his hands, which were bound behind his back, but the deputies firmly refused to allow it. As a result, I placed him into the coffin exactly as he was, still fully clothed. Not a single hair had been cut. His hair remained curled and was still held in place by a comb, which was buried with him as well. I laid him out inside the wooden coffin. It was later noted that the only thing missing was his shoes. He was wearing a slightly soiled white waistcoat, his shirt, gray breeches, and silk stockings. I then picked up his head and placed it back on his neck. His eyes were open when we lowered the body onto the bed of boiling quicklime. The priest stepped forward and recited prayers, after which we closed the lid of the coffin and added more water and additional lime pellets over the top and around the sides. Finally, earth was shoveled over everything, as can still be seen today. However, it would not be long before the French king needed to be exhumed. The restoration of the monarchy required this, and on January 18, 1815, digging began within the graveyard. The purpose of the exhumation was to provide King Louis XVI and his wife, Marie Antoinette, with a more dignified burial. They were to be reinterred in the Basilica of Saint Denis, the royal mausoleum containing the remains of many Bourbon rulers. The former gravediggers who had buried Louis were summoned back to assist, if they were still alive. In the Madeleine Cemetery, the ground was broken. On the first day, the remains of Marie Antoinette were located. They were easily identified, and even her stockings were recovered. It was also claimed that some of her hair was still attached to her skull. The remains of King Louis XVI were discovered the following day. A deep trench was dug close to the cemetery wall, where workers uncovered fragments of a coffin. They then found the skeleton of a man who had been decapitated and who showed injuries to the skull. The head had been placed between the legs inside the coffin, as had been done with Louis XVI, and no clothing was found. The quicklime that had been added during burial had clearly done its work, partially dissolving the king's remains. His bones were badly damaged and in an advanced state of decay. Further searches were carried out in the surrounding area to look for additional bodies. It was generally accepted that the remains discovered were indeed those of King Louis XVI. An official account of the exhumation stated that a deep trench near the wall was opened in their presence, revealing earth mixed with lime and several small pieces of wood that indicated the presence of a coffin. The search was conducted with the greatest care. Unlike the Queen's grave, which had contained a bed of pure lime, this grave held a mixture of earth and lime, with a greater proportion of lime. Within this mixture, the bones of a man were found, many of which were on the verge of crumbling into dust. The skull, covered in lime, had been placed between the leg bones. The searchers carefully looked for fragments of clothing, but found none. All the remains were collected, along with some pieces of lime, and placed into a cloth brought specifically for that purpose. Although the location of the remains matched the spot identified by eyewitnesses to the original burial, and the position of the head left little doubt as to the identity of the body, the authorities ordered the area to be dug to a depth of 12 feet and for a distance of 25 feet. This was done to determine whether any bed of pure lime existed elsewhere. No such bed was found, which further confirmed the already strong evidence that the remains belonged to the king. The collected remains were then placed into a chest, sealed with the arms of France, transported to the Hall of the Madeleine, and set beside the remains of the queen. Throughout this time, a priest continued to recite the prayers of the church over both bodies. As stated, the remains of the king and queen were exhumed in order to grant them a proper burial among the monarchs of France in the Basilica of Saint Denis. A large funeral procession took place, after which they were laid to rest in a tomb alongside many other kings and queens. Remarkably, Their bodies had escaped being thrown into a river or dumped into a pit during the Reign of Terror and the later years of the French Revolution, when the remains of many monarchs were desecrated. Accounts of the funeral describe how princes and princesses, followed by the Grand Master, the Master of Ceremonies, and his assistant, approached the altar to present their offerings. A funeral oration was then delivered by the Bishop of Troyes. After absolution was pronounced, the bodies were lowered into the royal vault, into which Monsieur and his two priestly sons descended and prostrated themselves upon the coffins of their royal relatives. Artillery salutes were fired when the procession departed Paris, during the service at Saint Denis, and again when the bodies were lowered into the vault. To this day, the remains of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette lie in a tomb within the royal vault of the Basilica of Saint Denis. The exhumation of Louis XVI revealed the partial remains of a king who had been widely regarded as an enemy of the people. His execution had not merely been intended to kill a single monarch, but to symbolically destroy and desecrate the very idea of monarchy throughout France.